The official intake form for the V-Thrani Athletic and Combat Assessment Program listed 11 physiological parameters. I know this because Velsarith handed me a copy of my own intake report on the first morning, the way you might hand someone a note explaining that their luggage has been lost and will not be recovered. "This is your baseline profile," she said. She was 2 meters and change, limbs like cable run through pale skin, the banded musculature of her forearms visible even at rest. Her species had a word for the way those bands flared when they were exerting themselves, something in V-Thrani that I was told roughly translated to the full expression. They were very proud of the full expression. The assessment center's walls were lined with still photographs of V-Thrani athletes in full expression, captured mid-competition in the instant their whole physiology ignited, and the effect was somewhere between a sports hall and a temple. 16 photographs on the main concourse wall alone. I had counted them while waiting for the intake briefing. I looked at my intake report. 11 parameters, 11 red notations. "Subthreshold," I said. "Across all 11, Velsarith confirmed. She wasn't unkind about it. She had the manner of a structural engineer reporting load tolerances, not cruel, simply precise. "The exchange program requires that we assess all candidates using the full V-Thrani protocol. You will be assessed on the same schedule as the cohort. Results will be logged in the standard format." "All right," I said. "You may withdraw at any point without record of failure. The program does not require completion." "I appreciate that," I said. "I'll plan to complete." She looked at me for a moment. It wasn't skepticism exactly, more the expression you'd give a load-bearing calculation that didn't resolve the way you expected. I had seen that expression on a lot of faces in the past 48 hours, starting from the moment I had come through intake processing, and the admissions officer had looked at my physical specifications, and looked at the program manifest and back at my physical specifications, and gone very quiet. "Very well," Velsarith said, and left me to change. The changing room was designed for V-Thrani proportions. The benches were chest height on me, the lockers were set into the wall at an elevation that required some reaching, and the shower stalls were long and narrow in a way that suggested the usual occupants were built entirely differently than I was, long, not wide, reaching in all the vertical directions. I managed fine. I'd done field assessments in worse-fitting facilities. I put on my assessment kit, standard issue, which they had cut down to my size with commendable speed given they'd clearly never done it before, and went back out to the main floor. The cohort was 11 V-Thrani and me. They were mostly in their 3rd or 4th year of the program, taller than Velsarith, a few of them, the older males especially, and they had the easy confidence of people who had been excellent at a thing for a long time and had stopped noticing it. I was 26, mid-height for a human female, built the way people who spend a lot of time hiking and not much time specifically training tend to be built, functional but unremarkable. My shoulders were broad by human standards. By V-Thrani standards, I looked like a draft sketch of a person that hadn't been fully rendered yet. The one who sat across from me at the first meal was named Rethavor. He was in his 4th year, tall even by cohort standards, the kind of quietly formidable that comes from years of directed conditioning, and he had a copy of my intake report. I wasn't sure how he'd obtained a copy, but I filed that under things to figure out later. "Subthreshold across all 11, he said in V-Thrani. He had a pleasant voice. He wasn't being hostile, there was something almost cheerful about it, the way someone might note an amusing curiosity. "Secondary musculature band absent. Resonance cartilage absent. Thermal regulation operates through surface moisture secretion." One of the others, a female named Selvath, made a sound of faint distaste at that last part. Thermal regulation through surface moisture secretion is, I was to learn, considered aesthetically poor in V-Thrani physical culture. They have a word for it that doesn't translate into anything flattering. She used it briefly and moved on. Maximum burst output listed here as, he squinted at the report, variable and context dependent. That's accurate, I said. Variable, he repeated. He found this funnier than I'd expected. A few of the others at the table had caught the thread of the conversation and were leaning in with the interested attention of people watching a mildly entertaining demonstration. And the oxygen uptake. Your species processes oxygen through a single set of chambers. 2 chambers, lungs. 1 on each side of the chest cavity. Right. And the chambers are not networked to the resonance system. We don't have a resonance system, I said. Our oxygen processing is simpler. High volume, relatively efficient, no secondary amplification. Rethavor set the report down. He wasn't crowing about it, which I respected. He seemed genuinely puzzled rather than contemptuous. The puzzle of a person encountering a physical specification that didn't match any category in his existing framework. The long-duration assessment block is day 2, he said. 8 hours of sustained output, progressive load increase. No rest intervals shorter than 4 minutes. The elimination threshold from last cycle was 40% of the cohort. What happened to them? They completed the block but below minimum time standards. They were rerouted to remedial conditioning. He paused. I say this so you understand the shape of what is ahead, not to discourage you, but the shape should be known. I appreciate that, I said, really. He looked at me. I was eating. He looked at my food, which was the human rations I'd brought, dense stuff, caloric, compressed into bars that were efficient to carry and not notably pleasant to eat, and then back at my face. And I think he was waiting for me to be defensive or nervous or something, and I wasn't any of those things, and that seemed to confuse him more than the report had. You understand you are sub-threshold across all 11 parameters, he said. I read the report, I said. He nodded slowly, picked up his own tray, and moved on down the table. Selvath stayed. She'd barely touched her food. She had the look of someone calculating something in her head that wasn't quite resolving, and she had been watching me with the steady, undemonstrative focus of someone who had decided to gather data before forming a conclusion. I found this, privately, encouraging. You're not concerned, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm a little nervous, I said, but not about the endurance block. What are you nervous about? I thought about it honestly. The food. I wasn't sure how my rations would hold up, and I've been eating these dense protein bars for 2 days. They're not bad, but they're monotonous. The ones at the bottom of the pack are slightly worse than the ones at the top, and I can tell I'm getting close to the bottom. Selvath stared at me for 3 seconds, then picked up her tray and left. I finished my meal. Around me, the cohort was doing what cohorts do at meal periods, recovering from a day's work, talking through the day 2 schedule in the half-attentive way of people who already know it well, the occasional glance in my direction that I didn't acknowledge because acknowledging it would change its nature. I was a curiosity. That was fine. Curiosity is neutral. Day 1 was the strength and burst assessment. I knew going in that this wasn't my ground. Humans can generate impressive short-duration power, but nothing that maps cleanly onto V-Thrani burst output metrics, which are calibrated for a physiology that can, apparently, briefly exceed its own resting oxygen requirements by rerouting energy allocation through the resonance cartilage in a way that I still don't fully understand. The full expression, again. It looks extraordinary when they do it. Every muscle band in the body fires simultaneously. The skin brightens slightly from beneath, and for about 40 seconds they can exert force that doesn't make sense given their mass. I cannot do that. My burst numbers came in exactly where the intake report said they would, sub-threshold. Velsareth logged them without comment. Keth Moth, the training second, did the same. Rethavor didn't say anything either, though I caught him checking the display once when he thought I wasn't looking, with an expression I couldn't read well yet. The Day 1 assessment was structured in 4 phases: static force application, dynamic burst sequence, anaerobic threshold testing, and the recovery drill. The first 3 phases I ran at or below the cohort's numbers across the board. I wasn't struggling, the loads were well within my capacity, but my absolute output was simply lower, and the metrics were calibrated to find the gap and record it, which they did thoroughly. What happened at the tail end of the 4th phase was the interesting part. The recovery drill was a continuous output sequence, not maximum force, just sustained moderate exertion, light load extended period. The idea, as I understood it, was to measure recovery rate after the burst sequence, to see how quickly the physiology restocked its short-duration reserves. The Vithrani cohort hit the drill, sustained it for the prescribed interval, and then their output started to taper as the recovery period extended. That was expected and correct. Their physiology burns very hot in the burst phase, and it takes time to reset. The resonance system requires recovery. The muscle bands need to discharge heat. The whole exquisitely calibrated engine needs a moment to breathe. Mine doesn't work that way. I hadn't burned anything in the burst sequence that needed recovery time. The burst sequence had been hard for me. It was near my ceiling in those phases, but the mechanism that made it hard for me was different from theirs, and the recovery curve from that kind of exertion is different. While they were cycling down, I was sitting at the same moderate output I'd started with, because for me, the moderate output drill felt like exactly what it was, a moderate output drill. Velsarith glanced at the display once. She didn't say anything. She made a note. I noticed Selvath notice. The cohort's numbers at the end of the recovery drill showed a range of outputs, all tapering from their burst levels down toward a recovery baseline. Mine showed a flat line at the same moderate output I'd maintained throughout. It was a small thing. The absolute number was still below cohort average, but the shape of it was different, and different shapes are what data people notice. Kethmoth said nothing to me directly. He and Velsarith exchanged something brief. I caught the exchange from across the room without being able to hear it, and then they both looked at my station display and then went back to their work. That evening I stretched outside the facility, which was a covered walkway with a view of Orvith Station's upper ring. The station had this particular light at that hour. The station day cycle was winding down, the overhead panels dimming in their slow simulation of evening, and the walkway was cool and empty, and it was a good place to work out the tightness in my hips from a day of assessments. I had been sitting too long in the briefing phases, and the assessment kit's lower body fit, while functional, wasn't designed for human hip geometry. Selvath found me there. I'm not sure if she'd been looking for me or if it was coincidence. She stood in the entrance to the walkway for a moment, evaluating the scene. "You're still moving," she said. "Stretching," I said, "helps with recovery." She came and stood near me. She had the slightly stiff posture of someone who wasn't sure why they'd approached and hadn't worked out an exit yet. "You were at the same output for the full 40-minute recovery drill," she said. The drill wasn't very hard for me at that intensity. I hadn't depleted anything that needed refilling. "You are sub-threshold across 11 parameters," she said, very carefully, as if reciting something she needed to be accurate about. "For burst output, yes. Day 2 is the endurance block." "Silence. The sustained output protocols favor your species," she said. "I don't know that," I said. "Nobody's run a human through your full protocol before. I'm genuinely not sure what's going to happen. I have some sense of my own physiology, but I've never been run through a controlled 8-hour progressive load protocol with standardized rest intervals and objective measurement. I'm interested to find out." This seemed to interest her more than a confident answer would have. She had that calculating look again, the one I'd noticed at the first meal. "You said you were nervous about the food," she said. "I've worked through most of my dense bars. The last ones I have are the slightly stale kind that come at the bottom of the pack. They taste like compressed cardboard with optimism." Selvath made a sound that might have been the Vithrani equivalent of a suppressed laugh. I wasn't sure. Their faces are mobile but not in the same way human faces are, and I was still learning the register, learning which small muscle movements corresponded to what, how much meaning to read into the position of the secondary expression bands above their primary features. She left without another word. I kept stretching until the overhead panels had dimmed all the way to their dusk setting, which was a kind of pale rose amber that made the whole walkway look like the interior of a lit shell. It was genuinely beautiful, and I sat there for a while after my stretching was done just watching the station's ring structure rotate through it. Day 2. The long-duration block. 8 hours, progressive load, rest intervals no shorter than 4 minutes, elimination threshold at 40%. Velsarith briefed us at 600. The facility was cool and slightly overlit the way assessment spaces always are, the walls still full of their photographed expressions of peak Vithrani effort. I had counted the photographs twice by now. There were 43 in the facility total, distributed across the main concourse, the 2 assessment halls and the corridor connecting them. The corridor ones were smaller. I noticed these things because noticing things is what you do when you're waiting, and I am good at waiting. Rethavor glanced at me once before we started, not cruelly, more like a person checking on an object they'd left somewhere uncertain. I ate my last 2 compressed cardboard with optimism bars at 5:45, drank a full liter of water, and thought about nothing in particular. There is a state I get into before long events that is not quite meditation and not quite blankness, more like a machine that has finished its startup sequence and is now idling at operational temperature, ready. I have been getting into that state since I was about 16 and started doing overnight trail events in the mountains near where I grew up. It takes practice to find it and practice to stay in it. I had found it. The structure of the block was locomotion phases alternating with weighted carry phases, rest intervals distributed according to the assessment protocol, the load increasing in defined increments across the 8 hours. For the Vithrani cohort, the challenge was cumulative fatigue management. Their physiology runs hot, accumulates load debt quickly, requires strategic recovery, or the output quality degrades sharply. The assessors were watching for degradation patterns. That was the diagnostic question the protocol was designed to answer. When does this candidate degrade and how fast, and in what shape? For me, the diagnostic question was different, and I suspected the protocol wasn't perfectly calibrated to answer it. But I would run the protocol as given and we would see. I don't degrade the same way. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I'm not trying to make it sound more dramatic than it was. Human sustained endurance isn't magic. It's not even that impressive by some measures. What it is persistent. We are built genuinely, structurally built, to move for a long time at moderate output. The feedback loops that tell us to stop are slower and more negotiable than in species that operate on a burst model. The metabolic systems that sustain moderate aerobic effort are efficient in a particular way, not efficient at peak output, not efficient at generating the kind of force that makes Vithrani photographs worth framing, but efficient at keeping going. Our thermal regulation through surface moisture secretion, which Selvath had regarded with faint distaste the evening before, is actually quite good when the challenge is maintain output for 8 hours in a temperature-controlled environment. The sweating, in other words, is load-bearing. By hour 3, the cohort was at 80 to 90% of starting output. That was very good. Their conditioning was excellent. Several of them were above target for the phase and packing deliberately to conserve. I was at 102% of my starting output. This is because the progressive load increase suited me better than the baseline had. The baseline had been light for me. As the load went up, I found a better working range. And the working range was closer to my actual moderate output zone, which is where my physiology is most comfortable. I was not peaking. I was settling in. Velsarith looked at the display. She made a note. By hour 5, the cohort was distributed. 4 of them still above 80%, 3 in the 70 to 80 range, 2 beginning to show degradation markers, 2 more in genuine difficulty. The assessors moved quietly between stations, logging, making the periodic observations that the protocol required. I was at 104%. Kethmoth, the training second, came and stood near my station for a while without saying anything. He was younger than Velsareth, with the highly calibrated posture of someone who had gone through the same assessment program he was now administering, and he had the look of a person running a diagnostic and not understanding the readout. He checked my station display twice. He checked the load parameters. He looked at me. "You are not fatiguing on schedule," he said. "I'm aware," I said. I wasn't laboring. My breathing was steady, the way it gets during long events when the output has been sustained long enough that the body stops treating it as an exertion and starts treating it as a state. The load increment we are using was calibrated for Vthrani physiological response curves. I understand. It might be a bit light for me in the middle hours. I considered how to phrase the next part without it coming out wrong. If you want a cleaner data set on my upper range, you could increase the increment by 30% for the last 2 hours. It would give you better numbers to work with. Kethmoth looked at me. He looked at the display. He went and spoke to Velsareth. She came over. She looked at my display and then at me with the expression I was starting to recognize as her recalibration face. The same expression she'd had at the intake briefing, the one that meant a calculation had come back unexpected. "You are requesting load modification during an in-progress assessment," she said. "Only as a data quality suggestion," I said. "You can leave it as is. I'll finish the block either way. But if you're trying to find where my curve starts to descend, the current increment probably won't get there in the time we have." She looked at the display for a long moment. She looked at me. "We will increase the increment," she said. 30% beginning at hour 6. "Thank you." She didn't respond to that. She went back to the center of the floor. The rest intervals were 4 minutes each, distributed at the transitions between load phases. 4 minutes is long enough to drink water and not much else, not long enough to sit, not long enough to let the body confuse rest with completion. I used them to drink water and eat the Vthrani standard ration snacks that were available to the cohort during the block. I had no human provisions left. The snacks were better than I'd expected, dense and mineral tasting, a flavor I had needed a day to calibrate to, but which now registered as neutral useful. Fuel, which is the relevant quality. During the hour 3 rest interval, one of the younger cohort members, a third-year male I'd exchanged maybe 6 words with over 2 days, came and stood near my station and looked at my output display without asking permission, which I didn't mind. He looked at it for about 15 seconds. He looked at me. He went back to his own station without speaking. I found this endearing. He was trying to understand something and had not yet decided what question to ask. Rethavor was at the station 2 rows over. I hadn't been watching him, but at hour 5 he had been at 91%, which was the best number in the cohort and clearly the product of deliberate, well-managed packing. He had been doing this a long time, and he knew his own physiology extremely well. He was watching me now. Not hostile, not mocking, just watching with the steady expression of someone reassessing a calculation they'd thought was settled. I didn't look at him directly. It would have been impolite. The load increase at hour 6 was noticeable. I felt it as a shift in effort demand, the way you feel the trail angle change when a path steepens. The body's workload bumps up and then the body adjusts. My output climbed to 106% briefly, then settled back as I found the new working range. Velsareth made another note. The last 2 hours with the increased increment were genuinely hard. Not overwhelming, but hard, the kind of hard that occupies the attention and requires management. I dropped from 104 to 101 by hour 7, then finished at 98 by the end of hour 8. 98% of my starting output after 8 hours, which I want to note clearly. My starting output was still below V-Thrani average. I wasn't beating them in absolute numbers. I was just still very close to where I'd started. The final numbers for the cohort had 4 of them above 90, 4 between 70 and 90, 2 below 70, and 1 who had been rerouted to rest at hour 6. The block concluded. Velsarith called the formal end. I sat down on the floor of the assessment hall, mostly because my legs wanted a moment, and I had learned to give them what they asked for at the end of a long block, and drank 1.5 liters of water over the next 20 minutes. Selvath came and sat near me. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has done something very hard and is still calibrating what they feel about it. Her output had been good. She'd finished in the high 80 range, which by cohort standing was 2nd or 3rd. She was not looking at me in the way she'd looked at me at the first meal. That look was gone. The new look was something else, the calculating assessment, but with the calculation further along. "You finished at 98, she said. "Roughly. You started at sub-threshold." "I did." "Your absolute numbers are still below cohort average." "They are," I said. "The assessment is calibrated for your physiology. I was never going to score above average on V-Thrani metrics. That's not what this is." She was quiet for a moment. "What is it then?" she asked. I thought about how to explain it. The question your protocol is designed to answer is, how much can a V-Thrani cadet sustain and for how long and how gracefully do they degrade under load? That's exactly the right question for your species. For mine, the interesting question is something else. How long can they keep going at a given output without the degradation curve finding the floor? And for that question, the honest answer is, I paused. I don't actually know the upper end. I've never hit it within a controlled protocol. Selvath stared at me. "You have never," she said carefully, "identified the upper limit of your sustained output endurance. No one's ever set up the right protocol to find it. Most assessments aren't built for it. They're built to find where you fall off. I tend not to fall off on the timescales that protocols usually run." I watched her absorb this. Something shifted behind her primary expression bands, a small realignment, the kind you make when a number lands that you weren't expecting. "The full assessment program is 4 days, she said. "I know. Day 3 is combined load and endurance. Day 4 is combat assessment simulation. Yes, I read the packet." She looked at me for a long moment. "How are you feeling?" she said. "A little hungry," I said. "I'm out of dense bars. Is the mess hall open?" The mess hall was open. I ate a large amount of the V-Thrani standard ration, which was calorie-dense in a different way than my human provisions, very protein-forward, with a texture like compressed mineral and a flavor that took some getting used to but was not, in the end, bad. It helped that I was hungry. Almost everything tastes acceptable when you've been going for 8 hours. Rethavor was eating at the far end of the hall. He didn't read my intake report at me this time. He nodded when I came in, which was a thing I noted. Kethmoth found me while I was finishing, and set down a datapad with what appeared to be revised assessment parameters. "For tomorrow," he said. "Day 3 is combined load and endurance," I said. "Yes, given today's data, Velsarith has authorized a protocol modification for your track." He paused. "Not to accommodate weakness, to generate interpretable data. Your sustained output curve does not map cleanly onto the standard evaluation framework. She wants a data set that will be useful." I looked at the modified parameters. The load increments were adjusted, calibrated differently than the cohorts but within the same range of demands, with the 8-hour block extended to 10 hours and the rest intervals shortened slightly. It would be harder than today. Good. "I can work with this," I said. "She also wants to know," he stopped, started again. "She would like to know if you have a sense of your upper range, your own estimate. We are constructing an appendix to the standard results document and she wants a data point to anchor it." I thought about it honestly. In terms of total duration at a maintained output, I've done multi-day events, long-distance competitions on my homeworld that run 70, 90 hours continuous. I was functional at the end of those. Not fast, not producing impressive numbers by any metric you'd care about, but moving and cognitively present. The curve levels off, but it doesn't collapse, not in the time frames I've run. Kethmoth did not say anything for a moment. 70 hours, he said. At the sustained moderate output level, yes. The output varies through an event like that, terrain, weather, sleep debt all affect it. But the degradation floor doesn't arrive when you'd expect it to if you were modeling based on burst physiology curves. You have done this more than once. Several times. The sport has a name. It translates loosely as long-distance mountain navigation racing. He picked up the datapad. Velsarith will want this on record, he said. I figured she would, that's why I told you. Day 3. Combined load and endurance, 10 hours with my modified parameters. The interesting thing about Day 3 was how quiet it was around my station. Not the facility had its usual ambient sounds, the equipment cycling, the assessors' periodic communications, the occasional exchange among cohort members as they moved between phases. But there was a quality of directed attention on my numbers that hadn't been there on Day 1, and it expressed itself not as noise but as its absence. People who are watching closely tend to go quiet. I've noticed this in a lot of different contexts. Velsarith was on the floor for the full 10 hours. Kethmoth was on the floor for most of it. They alternated proximity to my station, never crowding it, just present. Rethavor's station was close enough that I could track his output numbers on the shared display without appearing to seek them. He ran a very clean Day 3, better than Day 2, which I hadn't expected from him. He'd clearly learned something from the previous day's packing, had reworked his interval strategy, was distributing his recovery differently, and his output curve was steady, well-managed, precise. He finished the 10-hour block at 94%, which by any reasonable measure was excellent and probably the best result in the cohort. I watched him finish and thought, that's someone who knew how to adjust. That takes a particular kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with raw output numbers. I finished at 97. 10 hours, modified load protocol, and I finished 3 points below where I'd started the day. 3 points across 10 hours. Velsarith logged the result without comment. After the formal conclusion, I was putting my gear away when she approached. She had her datapad, and the particular focused expression she wore when she was consulting numbers, she'd looked at several times already and still wanted to look at again. Your Day 3 degradation curve, she said. Yes. It shows a decrease of approximately 3% across 10 hours with the modified increment. Yes. The cohort's average degradation across the same period was approximately 14%. I know. You experienced approximately 1/5 of the average cohort degradation. Yes. She looked at the datapad, she looked at me. How long can you sustain this? She said. It wasn't quite a question. It was the question from the mess hall conversation, the one Kethmoth had asked the night before, but now she was asking it directly and in person, and there was something different about the register of it. Not clinical anymore. More like the structural engineer who has run the load calculation 3 times because the first 2 didn't come back the way she expected, and on the 3rd run has decided to just ask the structure what it thinks. I genuinely don't know, I said. I've never had a controlled protocol that went long enough to find the floor. A pause that had some weight to it. Day 4 is the combat assessment simulation, she said. I know, I read the packet. The combat simulation does not run for 10 hours. I know that too. It runs for 4 hours, with high-intensity burst intervals distributed throughout. That's more my Day 1 than my Day 2, I said. The burst intervals will pull my numbers down. I won't look as clean in the simulation as I did in the endurance blocks. I understand that. I wanted to say it first so it's on the record. Whatever the day 4 numbers show is accurate. I'm not underperforming. The simulation is just calibrated for your burst physiology, which I don't have. Velsarith looked at me again. The expression had shifted slightly, not warmth exactly, but something in that direction. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who has recalibrated and knows it. You are not what the intake report described, she said. The intake report was accurate, I said. All 11 parameters were correctly measured. I am sub-threshold on every one of them. The report just didn't have a column for the dimension I've been demonstrating. The measurement tools were right. The reference framework had a gap. Velsarith was quiet for a moment. No, she said, it did not have that column. She made a note on her datapad and went to debrief the rest of the cohort. That evening, Selvath and I were both in the walkway again. This time she'd come there first. I found her sitting against the wall with her legs extended, working through what looked like a cooldown sequence, and I sat on the floor nearby and did the same. We stretched in silence for a while. The overhead panels were in their amberdusk cycle again. I looked up human endurance data, she said eventually. What did you find? There is not much in the Vithrani reference library. There is a comparative physiology section in the exchange program materials, but it is limited. It describes your species' oxygen uptake mechanisms and your thermal regulation and your burst output ranges, all of which match your intake report. It does not discuss sustained duration capacity. There is a note at the end of the physiology section that says, and I am translating roughly, human candidates are assessed under standard protocol. Contact the Exchange Directorate for performance normalization guidance. The contact information in the note is for an office that no longer exists at that address. That tracks, I said. You said multi-day events, 70 or 90 hours. Long-distance mountain running, mostly, and some multi-day navigation events. There's a tradition on my homeworld of very long overland competitions. They were originally practical, hunting and distance carrying, developed over a long time into sport. Selvath considered this. Your species hunted by pursuit. Among other methods, persistence hunting, yes. Track prey until it exhausts, which happens faster than the hunter exhausts, because our thermal regulation is better at sustained output and heat dissipation. We can run longer in the heat than almost anything we were hunting. Because of the surface moisture secretion. Because of the surface moisture secretion, I confirmed. You built your thermal system around your hunting method. Or the hunting method built itself around the thermal system. Hard to know which way it ran. But the result is the same. We're very good at moving for a long time at moderate output in warm conditions. The assessment facility is temperate by Vithrani preference, which is a little cooler than I'd pick, but within workable range. She thought about this for a while. The overhead panels had found their amberdusk level and were staying there now, and the light made the walkway feel warmer than the temperature warranted. The phrase on the photographs, she said. Which one? There is a phrase on the panel below the concourse photographs, in Old Vithrani. It translates to something like, the full expression for one moment is everything. The idea being that the peak instant, the full burst, completely committed is the measure of a physical life. She paused. I have been thinking about it differently today. How so? One moment that is everything, or many hours that are consistently something. She was not asking a question. She was working through a thought. The photographs show the peak instant. Your protocol shows a different kind of athlete. Neither one is the whole picture. No, I said. She was quiet for a while. Rethavor looked up the same data, she said. How did you know? Because he was in the reference library when I was. He did not acknowledge me and I did not acknowledge him. We both read the same section. I thought about Rethavor at the far end of the mess hall, nodding when I came in. I thought about how he'd run day 3, the adjusted packing, the intelligent interval management, the 94% at the end of 10 hours. What did he think? He did not say. He logged off and left the library. A beat. I think he is recalibrating. He does not recalibrate easily. His whole framework for the assessment has been built around absolute output metrics, because those metrics have always told him true things about candidate quality. When the metrics are telling him something he doesn't have a category for, it takes him longer. Is that a problem? No, he will get there. He is thorough. She paused. I got there faster because I noticed something at the first meal. What did you notice? You were not defensive about the intake report. When Rethavor read it aloud, you knew what was in it, you said so. You had already read it. Most candidates who receive a sub-threshold report across all 11 parameters either become defensive or become deferential. You were neither. You were interested. She tilted her head. That is a thing that is hard to perform. It is easy to perform confidence you don't have. It is hard to perform genuine interest in your own data. I was genuinely interested, I said. I'd never been assessed on your protocol before. I wasn't sure what the numbers would show. And now I know the numbers. They're accurate. They're measuring real things about my physiology. I paused. They're just not measuring the thing I've been doing for 3 days. The water that is still moving, Selvath said. What's that? A phrase from our endurance tradition. It is used for athletes who are very difficult to outlast, not because they are fast, not because they can exert maximum force, but because the attempt to exhaust them simply does not arrive. The water is still moving. It is always still moving. She paused. It is considered a form of excellence, quiet excellence. I held that for a moment. I'll take it, I said. Day 4. The combat assessment simulation was 4 hours of high-intensity intervals, scenarios designed to test decision-making under physical load, force application in constrained environments, navigation of simulated tactical problems under fatigue conditions. The Vithrani are very good at this. The full expression in a tactical context, the burst capacity directed through training into something purposeful. The facility had built these scenarios around Vithrani physiological strengths, and those scenarios showed it. I was not going to win day 4. I went in knowing that clearly and without distress. What I intended to do was finish it. The burst intervals were hard in the specific way day 1 had been hard. My absolute output numbers were below cohort average in every phase, and in the force application scenarios, I was clearly working at or near my ceiling, while several of the cohort members were managing well within theirs. The scenarios were designed for their physiology, and I was running them in a body that operated differently. I made adjustments where I could, different approaches to the force application problems, leveraging the aspects of the scenarios that favored sustained output over burst, taking lines through the tactical problems that used more time but less peak exertion. And I did not embarrass myself, but I also did not produce numbers that would have impressed anyone on a Vithrani baseline. The 4th-hour interval was the hardest single thing I did in the assessment. It was a force application problem in a constrained simulation space, with a physical load component and a time constraint, and it had clearly been designed to test candidates who were already deeply fatigued from 3 previous hours of work. For the Vithrani cohort, the challenge was managing their remaining burst reserves carefully through it. For me, the challenge was that I had never had much burst reserve to work with, and what little I had was fully committed by hour 3, and the 4th-hour interval required me to solve a force application problem using technique and body mechanics, rather than the output numbers the scenario had been calibrated to reward. I solved it. Not elegantly, not quickly. I came in at the bottom of the time window, which is still a pass, and the approach I used was noted in the session log as non-standard method, outcome within parameters. I found out about the log note later. At the time, I just finished the interval and moved on to the next phase. Rethavor was excellent. He ran a near-perfect day, 4 days of assessment, and he had clearly paced his whole program with this final block in mind. He had been saving reserves I hadn't known he had, and the simulation drew them out in the way these things are designed to do. Watching him run the force application sequences was like watching the facility's photographs come to life. The full expression, exactly calibrated, exactly where it was needed. He had earned those photographs on the wall, or would. I finished the 4 hours at 91% of my starting output. Not impressive by Vithrani metrics. Very slightly unusual, given that 4 hours of high-intensity burst intervals was genuinely demanding for me, and I had also run 10 hours the previous day and 8 hours the day before that. The cohort's day 4 numbers were mostly lower than their day 3 numbers expected attrition, cumulative load. Several were below 80%. Rethavor was at 96. I was at 91, and the attrition from my day 1, day 2, and day 3 outputs was roughly consistent, about 3 to 5% per day of accumulated decline, which was shallower than the cohort's curve even across a modality that was not my strongest. The simulation concluded. I sat down on the floor of the simulation bay, a different room from the previous days, with brighter lighting, white, blue, and high contrast, and the slight chemical scent of Vithrani exertion which I had learned to identify as a background note by now. I was sweating. No one mentioned it. I drank water. The third-year male who had looked at my display during the hour 3 rest interval on day 2 came and sat a few meters away from me on the simulation bay floor. He still had the air of a person who had not yet finished deciding what question to ask. Non-standard method, he said, which I understood to be a reference to the 4th hour interval. It was the method available to me, I said. It worked. It did. He thought about this. In the 3rd interval, you ran the force application sequence on the secondary approach vector rather than the primary. The primary vector was optimized for peak output over a short window. I don't have a short window. The secondary takes longer. Yes, but I was still in the time window, and at the point in the session when I made that choice, the cohort members who had the burst capacity for the primary were already showing fatigue markers. By the 4th interval, most of them were on the secondary anyway. He stared at me. You chose the secondary on interval 3 because you anticipated being in a better relative position by interval 4. I chose it because it was the approach my physiology could execute reliably. The relative position was a secondary benefit. He thought about this for a long moment. You have been running a different race, he said. I've been running the same race, I said, on different terrain. He didn't say anything else. He picked up his kit and left. I thought he would probably think about that exchange for a while. I thought that was fine. I stayed in the walkway until the panels had finished their dusk cycle and were beginning the slow ramp toward the dim hold setting that served as Orvith Station's approximation of night. The station didn't have a true dark period. It was a working facility, inhabited around the clock, but the lighting system cycled through something that gestured toward night, and in the walkway the gesture was convincing enough that I felt the day end. I was going to be stiff in the morning. The day 3 load had been 10 hours of cumulative work, and even at my degradation rates there was a deficit building, small but real. I had the good kind of tired, which is the kind that comes from having done something fully rather than from having tried something incompletely. The distinction matters. I've spent enough time in long events to know the difference in how it sits. The walkway was empty. The station's ring outside the viewport continued its rotation, indifferent and continuous. I thought about the photographs on the walls, the 43 frozen instants of full expression, each one capturing a Vithrani athlete at the absolute peak of what their physiology could do. They were genuinely beautiful. They were also a very specific thing, a record of ceilings reached. Appendix C was going to be a record of a ceiling not yet found. I thought there was something honest about that. I went in and ate a second large portion of the Vithrani standard ration and slept for 7 hours, which is enough. Day 4. Rethavor came and sat near me. He had the look of someone who has decided to say something and has been choosing how to say it for more than a day. I looked up your homeworld endurance records, he said. What did you find? The longest documented event on record for your species is a 104-hour continuous overland navigation. The record was set 41 years ago. 43 competitors started. 31 finished. That's the Kethvari circuit, I said. It's held every 4 years. It's considered one of the harder ones. The route changes each cycle to prevent course memorization from distorting the results. Rethavor was quiet for a moment. You have run this event, he said. Not a question. Twice, I said. I finished once with a result in the top half. The first time I had a navigation error in the third leg and went off route for 11 hours. I still finished, but outside the record window. I was annoyed about the navigation error for a long time afterward. You finished after going off route for 11 hours. Yes, late but finished. The rules allow completion outside the record window. You still receive a classification. He absorbed this. I apologize, he said. I looked at him. He was not uncomfortable saying it. That was the thing that surprised me. I'd expected the apology to cost him more, given how easy the mockery had been at the first meal. For reading your report aloud at the first meal, he said. It was not a useful thing to do. The report was accurate and I used it to draw a conclusion the report did not actually support, because I had not thought carefully about what the report was measuring and, more importantly, what it was not measuring. The report measured what it measured, I said. Yes, but, he paused. The gap in the measurement was mine to notice. I did not notice it until you showed it to me across 3 days. I thought about that. You ran a very good day 3, I said. The packing adjustment from day 2 was smart. That 94 at 10 hours is a real number. He looked at me. I think he had expected something else, maybe to give the apology and receive a formal acknowledgement and have that be the end of it. Instead, I was talking about his performance data, which was the most relevant thing I could think of to say. You were watching my numbers, he said. I had a clear view of the display from my station. I wasn't specifically tracking you, but your output was visible. You noticed the packing adjustment. It was a good adjustment. You figured out something about your own curve that wasn't in the standard protocol guidance. That's harder to do than running the standard protocol well. He was quiet for a moment. The expression on his face was still recalibrating. I could see it happening, the Vithrani equivalent of a long blink, a slight reorientation of the secondary expression bands. The water that is still moving, he said. So Selvath had told him, or he had found it himself in the library. That's the phrase. It is not normally used for exchange candidates. Selvath said the same thing. She told you she said that. In the walkway last night. He considered this. She does not usually share assessments before they're formally given. Maybe she thought I'd want to know. Maybe, he said, with a tone that suggested he thought there was more to it than that. He stood up. He was taller standing than the photographs made him look. The photographs had been taken at the full expression, when the body is in its most expanded state. At rest he was just tall, the way his species is just tall. He picked up his gear. How long could you have gone, he said, if the protocol had continued, an honest estimate? Day 5 would have been interesting. We'd be getting to the part of the curve where I start losing ground more clearly, the accumulated deficit would be showing. Day 6, I'd be slower, but moving. I thought about it. After day 6, I'm genuinely in uncharted territory. I've never run a controlled protocol past a few days. The data doesn't exist. The assessment runs 4 days, he said. I know. By design, because 4 days is considered sufficient to generate complete data on any candidate. It was sufficient to generate useful data, I said. It just didn't find the floor. He nodded once. It was a different kind of nod than the one at the mess hall on day 2, less acknowledgement, more something like recognition. He went to join the others. Velsareth gave the formal assessment conclusion at 1800. The cohort results were distributed in the standard format: individual performance summaries, cohort percentile rankings, commendations for Rethavor and 2 others who had performed above projection. The format was clean and efficient, the way Vithrani administrative documents tend to be. Everything in its place, every column filled, the language precise. Near the bottom of the document, a notation in smaller text: Human Exchange, Candidate Noravance, Earth Alliance, assessed under modified protocol per attached supplemental. See Appendix C for complete performance data and reference column adjustments. Appendix C was 4 pages. It began. The standard 11-parameter assessment framework does not generate interpretable comparative data for human exchange candidates operating in sustained output assessment contexts. The following reference column adjustments are proposed for future exchange program intakes of human candidates. Adjustments are based on 4-day performance data collected during the current assessment cycle and should be considered preliminary. Additional data cycles are recommended before formal adoption. The adjustments followed: 11 revised columns, notes on modified protocol methodology, day-by-day degradation curve analysis, the multi-day event data I'd given Keth Moth, appended as supplemental context, and at the very bottom, one line that hadn't existed in any Vithrani assessment document before that day. Sustained output ceiling, human, not established within protocol parameters. Velsareth did not read Appendix C aloud during the formal conclusion. She covered the main results, distributed the individual packets, acknowledged the commendations, and dismissed the cohort with the clean efficiency she brought to everything. As people were filing out, she stopped me. The appendix will be forwarded to the Exchange Program Directorate, she said. They will determine whether to incorporate the revised reference columns into the standard intake framework. I understand, I said. Do you think they will? She considered it. They will need more data. One candidate is not a population. Fair. But the current framework produces gaps, she said. It measures what it measures, and what it does not measure is now documented. Is that a yes? Velsareth had a particular relationship to understatement that I had come to respect over 4 days. She deployed it deliberately, the way a very precise person chooses every word with care and expects you to hear exactly what was said. It is a documented gap, she said. Documented gaps are addressed. I'll take that as a yes, I said. That is your prerogative, she said. I thanked her. She nodded once, made a final note on her datapad, and went back to her work. I caught the transit back from Orvith Station 2 days later. The departure hall was the typical transit hub noise of a large station: movement, announcement loops, the compressed smell of recycled atmosphere that every space facility shares. I had my pack, my mostly empty provision pouches, and the copy of my assessment results that Velsareth had provided. The results packet included my individual summary, sub-threshold across all 11 standard parameters, which was correct, which remained correct, which would never not be correct on Vithrani metrics. Below the summary, a notation. See supplemental reference data, Appendix C assessed under modified protocol due to physiological variance requiring non-standard evaluation framework. I read that line twice. Physiological variance requiring non-standard evaluation framework. There's no way to make that sound flattering in a literal read. Sub-threshold and requires special handling. On the face of it, not a great report. but I knew what Appendix C said. And I knew that somewhere in the Exchange Program Directorate's filing system, there was now a 4-page document establishing that the standard protocol had no ceiling to offer me in the time frame it ran, and that future intake assessments for human candidates would require a separate column. A separate column is not a small thing. It means the existing framework was missing a dimension. It means someone had to demonstrate the missing dimension before it could be written down. I got to be that. I boarded the transit. The seat was designed for Vithrani proportions, slightly too tall, slightly too wide, and I propped my pack under my feet to sit at a useful angle, which I had become practiced at over the past several days. Somewhere behind me in the departure hall, the overhead announcements cycled through in Vithrani and the 3 other major station languages. The lights were the cool blue-white of a transit hub at full function. Outside the viewports, Orvath Station's ring structure rotated in the slow, practiced way of something that had been moving for a long time and intended to continue. I ate the last of my compressed cardboard with optimism bars, which had gotten somewhat worse over the week, though I had also gotten more accustomed to them, and I thought those 2 facts roughly balanced out. I opened a book. The transit departed on schedule. I had come in as a footnote, 11 red notations and a withdrawal option I hadn't taken. The footnote now had 4 pages attached, and a ceiling that nobody had found yet. I didn't think about that too long. There were other exchange programs on the list, and the next one had a very long field assessment module, and nobody there had run a human through it either. I was looking forward to that.